There are very few substances that are considered as harmful as the salt, and we've all heard that salt consumption is bad for our health. This is why in this video we're going to see why our body needs salt, why our muscles need salt, and even our neurons. And of course, we're also going to see what's the scientific literature telling us and the impact to our body when we reduce the amount of salt in our diet. Historically speaking, for all people, salt and sodium have been always important. In fact, since the Roman Empire, the soldiers that patrol the road from Ostia to Rome will receive their salary in salt. And basically that's where salary comes from the word salt. In Greece, they would use salt to trade for slaves. Historically, our ancestors consumed a lot more salt than the people today during the 16th century. In fact, in Europe, the use of salt to preserve fish and meat meant a 10x increase in the consumption of salt from that of today. Even in more recent times, during the First and Second World War, the consumption of salt was higher than the recommended 2 grams per day. And we associate high sodium consumption to hypertension. However, today sodium consumption is lower, but we still have higher percentages of people with hypertension than in the 1940s. So why is this, and why is this still happening? If sodium causes hypertension, then we should see a decrease in this sort of issues. So why are people still reporting hypertension problems? To understand this, we need to know why sodium is important for our body. Sodium belongs to a group of minerals called electrolytes, and the amount of minerals that form salt are several of them, like chloride, magnesium, calcium, and potassium. These minerals are important for electrical impulses generated by the body, and they are what gives our cells that electrical charge that's generated both inside and outside the cell. We need this electrical charge to function properly because our bodies function on electrical principles. The electrical difference both inside and outside the cell generates an electrical potential, which in turn is what generates an electrical charge. Other than acquiring an electrical charge from these electrolytes, they are also essential to maintain a proper electromagnetic charge, given that every cell has a polarity, which means that they have a side that is more positive and another side that's more negative. Therefore, if we restrict ourselves from salts and minerals, this will result in negative side effects to our health, side effects that are more severe than if we were to exceed the daily intake of salt, which would generate effects that are contradictory. For example, we always tend to correlate the excess of sodium to hypertension, but when the blood flow drops as they arrive to the kidneys, which is something that happens when we have low levels of sodium in the blood, our kidneys will then release a substance called renin. This is to increase the arterial pressure. And now with this, we have a paradox because the restriction of sodium creates the same problem that is claiming to fix if we reduce the amount of salt intake. So what do? We need to understand that to take into account that we need to have a balance, because the key is to find a balance, that happy middle with every other mineral. And the studies have shown that the majority of the population, they have a deficit in potassium at the intracellular level, a mineral which helps to reduce blood pressure and therefore hypertension. At the same time, potassium used to be consumed by our ancestors a lot more in higher dosages, about 7 times greater than the recommended daily intake that we have today. This information tells us that we have a clear disproportion between sodium and potassium. So the balance between sodium and potassium is essential for the sodium-potassium pumps that we have within our cells. This pumps essentially remove 3 particles of sodium from the interior of the cell, and it lets 2 particles of sodium in. This exchange allows our cells to generate a more negative charge in comparison to the liquid that's found on the outside of the cell. This process is necessary for the accumulation of a negative charge and to create cellular activation. It doesn't matter if it's your muscles or neurons, but this is done to depolarize cells. Historically, we all hear that the high consumption of salt will lead to hypertension. So let's observe the ethnic groups that have a higher sodium consumption. The ethnic group that I'm referring to is South Korea, which among the groups that are ranked low in problems related to cardiovascular and hypertension problems, they rank the lowest. In Korea, the average consumption is more than double the amount that's recommended by the WHO, and we can observe that there is no problems related to hypertension even with this high intake of salt. So what would lead to create these results? What will lead to have these results? And there's a clear explanation, but first we can observe that the Korean diet doesn't include refined salt. It comes with kimchi, soy sauce, and sea salt. Second, a normal diet includes lots of algae, fish, and fermented foods and vegetables. This points to the fact that there is a high omega-3 consumption than other diets around the world. Now that we know that South Korea is one of the places with higher salt consumption, I invite you to do this research on your own. But the interesting aspect about this is that the people that had this high consumption of salt were the ones that had the least amount of problems related to hypertension and coronary disease or cardiovascular issues. And because this information is contradictory to what is globally considered right, we call this the Korean paradox. It is also important to mention that all the blue zones where we find higher concentration of people living longer have a higher consumption of sodium than that of the average amount. The consumption of sodium does have several important functions. One of those is the production of thyroid hormones. This is accomplished by using iodine, but the iodine needs to get inside of the thyroid gland. Therefore, if we don't have enough sodium, the iodine will not be able to get inside of the gland, because for every particle of iodine, we need 2 particles of sodium to make this transport. Without this transport, we won't be able to form T3 or T4, which are the thyroid hormones. Now that you understand that lowering sodium, it isn't such a good idea, we need to understand why sodium is important. Because sodium is also important to create strong bones, to pump blood, and it is important if you want to have good circulation. It is necessary to lower inflammation. It also allows for better digestion and increase the speed of metabolism, and especially to lower the levels of stress and cortisol. On the other hand, it is absolutely necessary to maintain an electrical charge in your cells, which is necessary for good cognitive function. The need for sodium when it comes to cognitive function is so noticeable that whenever we have a complex task or we need lots of focus, the dendrites of the neurons that help them communicate between them are going to increase the demand for sodium. Sodium is so important for cognitive function that many diseases that attack the brain, such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, will damage the sodium-potassium pumps in our neurons. And to clarify, sodium doesn't actually make us smarter, but the deficits of sodium will have side effects in our cognitive performance. It's going to alter our blood flow, and it's also going to affect our sleep quality. Something that's quite surprising about this and the side effects that we can develop from a low consumption of sodium is that we keep seeing the same advice being given by the nutritional field. Even when the very reputable journals like American Journal and the New England Journal of Medicine reported after a decade-long study that the people who consume a reasonable amount of sodium that is well below the 7 grams per day had a lower risk of cardiovascular problems and hypertension. These studies also demonstrated that if we have someone with a high excess of sodium consumption or we have someone with a deficit, in both cases they would both represent a risk to our health. The results of these research showed that the risk was greater with someone that had a lower consumption of sodium. If we think about the appropriate amount of sodium consumption with respect to physiology that it would be able to help us maintain good body functions, we need an approximate amount of 65 milligrams of sodium per kilogram. And this amount is a contradiction to nutritional guidelines and more than the recommended amount. This quantity would amount for someone that weighs 77 kilograms, an average of 5 grams of sodium per day. Hypertension and cardiovascular problems are really complex and have many different variables such as stress, inflammation, fat oxidation, sedentary lifestyle, damage to the tissues, poor diet, etc. All these are variables that play a key role in our cardiovascular health. Sodium is not the cause of hypertension. The studies have not shown a direct correlation to the causation. But if you're worried and you want to improve your cardiovascular problems, reduce the stress, reduce the levels of fat oxidation, and you can also reduce the levels of inflammation by increasing the level of exercise. And with all this information, I'm not implying that you should consume more salt, but instead to understand the complexity of the minerals and the many physiological processes that we need them for, and to be able to keep a good health. And if you found this video helpful and you got value out of it, hit the like button, hit the notification bell, and subscribe, because there will be more videos like this one coming up. See ya.